If someone tells you to think of a spy, I'm about 95% sure you're going to think of Bond. Just like Sherlock Holmes is the detective, Bond is the spy. These characters have become so iconic that they've basically become synonymous with their entire genres. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm some massive James Bond fan. In fact, I only watched the Daniel Craig movies this year, and I ended up enjoying them quite a bit. But I am a big fan of video games, especially story-driven games. So when a new James Bond game was announced, it immediately caught my attention. The trailers looked promising, the gameplay concept interests me, and since it was being developed by the same studio behind Hitman, I figured it was worth checking out. And honestly, I came away pleasantly surprised and disappointed, which is weird because those two things don't normally happen at the same time. Also, there are going to be some pretty major spoilers throughout this analysis and review, so if you want to play the games yourself, go do that first and then come back. Also, basic YouTuber thing, if you like this video, go check out some of my other stuff, and if you like that stuff as well, why not subscribe? 007 First Light does a great job paying homage to the classic spy thrillers that came before it, while still bringing something new to the table. At its core, the story follows James Bond as he learns what it actually means to be a spy. And just as he officially starts earning his place within MI6, everything immediately goes to shit. With the deaths of the other 00 trainees due to this game's villains being Nicholas Webb and his son Damian Webb. We'll talk more about them in the character analysis, but I will say them being the villains really isn't that important. The story is about Bond and his personal development and his relationship with other members within MI6. By the end, Bond is a fully realized agent, the immediate threat has been dealt with, but there are more on the horizon. Something that made me realize this was going to be an interesting story was for the fact that I wasn't able to predict the story beats as well as I normally do. Normally I can guess what was going to happen, and I was honestly starting to wonder if it was going to be a letdown, with the whole story being about chasing down a former spy turned rogue. You know, a staple in this genre. But when we find 009 dead, that's when I knew this story wasn't going to be what I was expecting. Overall, 007 First Light is a great story whether you're an existing fan or know nothing about James Bond. I think that's why I liked it. I didn't need to know all the James Bond lore, but I was rewarded for what I did know. I love the references to Kingsman, or the chapter titles being references to the movie titles, or even the classic being strapped down with a laser threatening to cut you in half. Although it is revealed that it is just a stonecutter, which might be worse now that I think about it. This game is just a love letter to the spy genre, while also having really interesting characters and an intriguing story, which had me wanting more by the end. Which I've said before, to me, is a sign of a great story. Now, as much as I liked the story, there was one issue that kept bothering me throughout the entire game. The dialogue. Not the cutscenes, those were fantastic. In fact, the quality jump whenever the cutscenes started was immediately noticeable. They were well directed, well acted, and often felt like scenes pulled straight out of a Bond movie. The problem started once I got control back. There were multiple occasions where I'd move too quickly and accidentally cut off conversations before they had finished, and it happened throughout the game quite a bit. But it was especially noticeable during the final mission. It's not a huge issue, but it happened often enough that it became annoying. And speaking of annoying, the characters never stopped telling you what to do. During the same final encounter, Bond kept repeating that he needed to use the environment. Thanks, Bond. I figured that out after the first 5 seconds. You don't have to keep saying it over and over again while I'm actively doing what you are saying. The same thing happens when you're escaping a burning building and Bond constantly reminds you that you should probably leave. Really? I was actually planning on staying a little longer, maybe get a nice tan while the building collapsed around me. Good thing Britain's Greatest Spy was there to remind me that fire is in fact bad. Patrick Gibson does a great job portraying a young James Bond. I'll admit, it took me a little while to stop hearing him as young Dexter from Dexter Original Sin, but by the halfway point I wasn't seeing an actor anymore, I was just seeing Bond. His character follows the classic formula of a young, inexperienced, overly confident protagonist who becomes more hardened throughout his experiences. What I liked most is that his introduction immediately establishes the traits that define him throughout the story. The first is his resilience. James Bond is basically the Captain America of spies. And no matter what gets thrown at him, Bond just keeps moving forward, even when everyone tells him the odds are against him. He refuses to quit. The second defining trait is his willingness to ignore orders, which he does quite a lot. One thing I found particularly interesting was how much Bond changes after the bombing. That's like a perfect spot for a pun, by the way. Anyways, up until that point, he's fairly carefree, constantly joking around and acting like he's invincible. But after the attack, there's a noticeable shift in his personality. He still cracks jokes, but there's a seriousness underneath them now. You can tell he finally understands the weight of what he signed up for. I also really like the moment near the end of the game where Bond jokes about keeping the designation of 007 instead of becoming 001. Sure, he could simply prefer the number, but I interpret it differently. I think it's out of respect for the other recruits who never got the chance to properly serve as 00 agents. Outside of Bond, there are 6 other recruits training as part of the new 00 program. The first being Cressida Bright. Cressida is one of the first people Bond connects with and one of the few recruits who immediately welcomes him into the group. She's ambitious, intelligent, and a perfectionist. Growing up in a wealthy family gave her many opportunities that many others never had. But unlike some privileged people, she never takes those opportunities for granted. Instead, she works relentlessly to make the most of them. Alongside Monroe and Moneypenny, Cressida becomes one of Bond's closest friends during training. Unfortunately, she also had one of the most tragic stories in the game. Although she survives the attack, she suffers a severe spinal injury that permanently prevents her from returning to fieldwork. It's later mentioned that she returns to MI6 in a clerical capacity, but it's clear her dream career is over. Honestly, I think she's one of the saddest characters in the entire story. She loses her friends, she loses the future she spent her entire life working towards, and for someone whose entire identity revolves around excellence and achievement, being forced onto the sidelines must be devastating. Monroe is essentially Cressida's opposite. He's one of the last recruits to accept Bond, and he spends much of the early game openly hostile towards him. A lot of that probably comes from his military background. Unlike some of the other recruits, Monroe appears to have fought for every opportunity he's been given, which likely makes Bond's fast-tracked entry into the program difficult to accept. That eventually changes when the two of them nearly beat each other to death in a fistfight, which, at the same time, causes thousands of pounds worth of property damage. Nothing builds friendship faster than trying to kill each other. After Bond proves he can hold his own, Monroe's attitude changes completely towards him. The two become incredibly close friends. Like Bond, Monroe uses humor to deal with situations, but his defining characteristic is loyalty. In a world filled with spies, secrets, and betrayal, Monroe consistently puts his friends above everything else, even the mission. Unfortunately, that loyalty is ultimately what gets him killed. Instead of reporting Bond for going off script, he helps him and even trusts him enough to leave his post, and that's what gets him killed. Singh and Kingsley don't get nearly as much screen time as Monroe or Cressida, but they still help make the group feel believable. Both recruits are killed during the attack, making their deaths another loss for Bond and MI6. Then there's Ronson. We don't learn much about him either, but unlike many of the others, he survived the attack. Unfortunately, he's left in a coma, making his future uncertain. Robert Nash. Robert Nash is probably the most suspicious person in the entire game. Unlike the other recruits who died during the attack, Nash simply disappears. There isn't much character development for him, and you only interact with him a handful of times. But let's be honest, this guy looks like a villain, and I won't be surprised if he returns in the future. And overall, he's fairly smart. Instead of hanging around or coming back, he just dipped. He was out of there, and he's just gone MIA. But I'll be honest, I can't blame the guy. If someone killed all my friends, I'd be ditching too. Greenway was probably my third favorite character in the entire game. He's the stereotypical aging agent who becomes cynical after years of service. At first, he absolutely despises Bond. The only reason he tolerates him is because M orders him to. Despite his attitude, Greenway is one of the most capable agents in MI6. He's the first person to suspect something is wrong with the mission that gets several agents killed, and throughout the story he constantly is helping Bond survive situations that would otherwise kill him. Initially, Greenway's role is to refine Bond's natural talent and teach him the realities of spycraft. And over time, Bond gradually earns his respect. His real turning point comes when he discovers the truth about the original 00 agents. For years, Greenway believed they had betrayed their country. The reality is that they were innocent. Worse still, he was manipulated into helping eliminate them. Greenway's entire identity revolves around loyalty to Queen and country. He follows orders because he believes those orders are morally right. Learning that he killed innocent friends completely shatters that worldview. So much so that he goes off-grid and he isn't heard from again till he chooses to help Bond bring down the people responsible. And by the end of the story, he saves Bond's life multiple times. My interpretation on why Greenway came back is because he understands he can't undo the mistakes of his past. The only thing he can do is ensure Bond succeeds where he failed, which gives his final sacrifice some meaning. He couldn't save the original 00 agents, but he could at least save the last one. Moneypenny is just cool. There's no deeper analysis there. She's simply a really likable character. The game does a great job of showing that she has a life outside of MI6, while also proving she's incredibly dedicated to her work. More than anything, I just enjoyed her chemistry with Bond. Every scene they share is entertaining and the friendship between them feels natural. She ended up being one of my favorite characters despite technically spending most of the game sitting behind the desk. I liked M. Although she doesn't receive much character development, her role is essentially to keep MI6 from collapsing into complete chaos. She clearly has a soft spot for Bond even if she'd never openly admit it, and most of her purpose in the story is to act as a mentor and authority figure. But I hope future games explore her character more because there's definitely room for growth. Alright, let's go through the villains from my least favorite to my favorite. Nicholas Webb is an interesting character, but he's probably the least compelling villain in the game. At his core, he's the classic billionaire corporate executive who genuinely believes he's making the world a better place while at the same time trampling over everyone beneath him. He's the type of person who can justify absolutely anything to themselves. No matter what evidence you present or how many people get hurt, he'll always find a way to convince himself that he's doing the right thing. One aspect of his character that I found interesting was his relationship with his son. When Bond first encounters them, it feels like Webb barely cares about his son. Especially when Bond thinks he killed his son in their last confrontation. Nicholas doesn't seem to give a shit. But as the story progresses, it becomes harder to tell whether that's actually true because his son survived. The real question is whether Nicholas values his son as simply his son or as an effective soldier. And honestly, I'm not sure Webb himself knows the answer. Overall, Nicholas Webb works well as the game's primary antagonist because he's a threat to MI6 as an institution, rather than a direct threat to Bond himself. His conflict with Bond isn't particularly personal. Bond simply happens to be the person who discovers the flaws in his supposedly flawless system. And Bond continuously interferes with what he had planned. Webb doesn't hate Bond. He's just incredibly annoyed that Bond won't stay out of his way. Now we're getting into the more interesting villains. The reason Webb's son works so well is because he's essentially Bond's mirror image. Both are highly capable field operatives, both are stubborn, both ignore orders when they think they know better, and both are willing to take enormous risks to accomplish their goals. The difference is what drives them. Bond is ultimately motivated by protecting people. Webb's son is motivated by desperate need for approval and power. When we first meet him, he comes across as charming, confident, and cool. In many ways, he feels like Bond. But as the story progresses, the cracks start to appear. Unlike Bond, he's deeply insecure. When things stop going according to plan, he becomes increasingly unstable and aggressive. Where Bond tends to think creatively and adapt to changing situations, Webb's son prefers a direct confrontation. If something gets in his way, his solution is usually to punch it. And to be fair, he's very good at punching things. Out of all the villains in this game, he's probably the most physically dangerous. The guy can fight. He can take an absurd amount of punishment, and he just keeps coming. What I really liked was by the end of the game, his physical appearance mirrors his heart. Completely messed up. Although he isn't a mastermind behind the conspiracy, he's definitely the most personal villain Bond faces throughout this story. Now we have the Pirate King himself, Bawa. Did I say that properly? Probably not. Honestly, this guy is just cool. He's not the deepest character in the game, but every scene he's in is entertaining. He has a confidence and presence that immediately makes him stand out from the rest of the cast. What I particularly liked was, unlike many villains who constantly talk about how powerful they are, Bawa actually just backs it up. When a coup is launched against him, he shuts it down in one of the most brutal and memorable scenes in the game. And throughout his entire story, Bawa somehow manages to stay on top. He even ends up saving Bond at one point. Sure, it's mostly for his own benefit, but still, technically that counts. What makes Bawa fun is he's not blindly loyal to anyone except himself and his sister. He's not fighting for some grand ideology, he's not trying to save the world, he's not trying to destroy it either. He's simply looking after his own interests. And that unpredictability makes him one of the most enjoyable villains in the game, even if he's there for a very short time. Overall, while none of the villains reach the heights of many villains that do exist, they do exactly what they need to do. They challenge Bond in different ways. Nicholas Webb challenges MI6, Webb's son challenges Bond directly, and Bawa exists purely to remind everyone that no matter how prepared you are, chaos will always be around. Alright, let's talk about the gameplay, because this is where 007 First Light gave me conflicting feelings. The first thing we need to talk about is the bluffing mechanic. This is probably the most unique feature the game brings to the spy genre. When I first saw it in the trailers, I was genuinely intrigued, and after playing the game, I'd say it mostly delivers. It's not quite as revolutionary as I was hoping, but it's still a really cool mechanic. I found myself using it less than I expected, mainly because stealth in combat usually felt more like a reliable option. However, where the bluff system really shines is when you get caught. Instead of instantly turning every mistake into a firefight, the game gives you a chance to talk your way out of trouble. It's essentially a second chance mechanic, but one that fits perfectly within the Bond fantasy. And more importantly, it opens the door for future games to expand on this idea further. One of my favorite aspects of the game is how much freedom you're given when approaching objectives. If you have the right tools and can think creatively, there's usually more than one way to solve a problem. And if all else fails, you can always just shoot everyone. My favorite example of this concept is the fighting arena. Instead of actually participating in the fights, I just simply poisoned my competitors and just knocked them out. Problem solved. The game does reward you for experimenting rather than simply following the obvious path. The levels are also packed with environmental objects that can be used during combat encounters, making gunfights feel more dynamic than simply hiding behind cover and shooting. Speaking of gunfights, combat is surprisingly enjoyable. The game uses a slow motion mechanic that's been around for years, but there's one small twist I really appreciated. After getting a kill, time immediately returns to normal. That simple decision prevents players from abusing the mechanic and keep firefights feeling fast-paced rather than turning every encounter into a Max Payne montage. Gunplay itself feels oddly nostalgic. The circular aiming reticle reminded me of the early 2000s shooters, and while that's probably just nostalgia talking, I genuinely enjoyed it. It's been a long time since I've played a game that used that sort of aiming style, but I do appreciate it. Of course, it wouldn't be a Bond game without gadgets. Some definitely are better than others, but overall, I thought that they added a lot to the gameplay. The beauty of the gadget system is that it lets players approach situations differently depending on their preferred playstyle. Want to blind everyone before storming a room? Use these incredibly suspicious not AirPods gadget. Want to play a modern Assassin's Creed? Smoke bombs have you covered. Some gadgets were less useful for me personally. The camera launcher that throws people across the room was cool in theory, but I rarely found myself using it. The rocket pen was also fun that we unlocked later on, but it almost felt too powerful, so I mostly chose not to abuse it that much. The two gadgets I used the most were the dart phone and the laser band. The dart phone is incredibly versatile. You can use it to weaken enemies before a fight or manipulate guards in abandoning their posts. It's useful in almost every situation except when it comes to groups. The laser band, however, was easily my favorite. Sure, you can use it to temporarily blind enemies, but the real fun comes to using it to bypass entire sections of missions. Need to open events? Laser. Need to unlock a door and not kick it in? Laser. Need to skip an entire section because you can't be bothered doing it properly? Laser.
I stuck walking you and those tiny shorts to the bar.
Holy shit! I need me one of those.
All right, folks, the bar is open.
It's one of those gadgets that constantly feels useful, and probably was the one that they thought about the most while developing the maps. One thing I also really appreciated was how the game occasionally takes away your gadgets. The prison section was where I noticed it the most. After spending hours relying on your gadgets, suddenly being forced to operate without them feels genuinely uncomfortable. It's a great way of showing players how much you end up relying on this stuff once you get comfortable with it. Something I also really liked is the small details of characters kind of having a life outside of when Bond's around. You can usually see this with small talk around the office or in Q's lab. The best example is when MI6 is under attack. You can find these two who have basically been friends the entire time talking in the office whenever Bond's around, and, you know, one of them dies. And it does make them feel like actual people. However, there wasn't too much of this. Okay, let's talk about the soundtrack real quick. It's good. I mean, it's James Bond. The theme is iconic, and the music constantly teasing you when it comes on in the background during action scenes. And then the reward at the end of the game with its most iconic scene, it pays off, and I really enjoyed it. Overall, my biggest compliment probably has to be it did feel like a spy movie a lot of the time. Probably my favorite example of this is the training scene and skydiving, as well as every cutscene. It did feel like a movie, and I enjoyed it. Now, as much as I've praised the game, there are some issues, otherwise I've lied in the thumbnail. Let's start with the story. While I think the overall narrative is excellent, there are simply too many characters for everyone to get proper development. This is especially noticeable with the villains. There are multiple antagonists competing for screen time, and as a result, some of them never get the chance to fully shine. A part of me wonders whether the game was originally planned to be larger before some ideas were pushed into the future sequel, especially considering the game ends with a Bond will return teaser. Despite that, I still think the story works remarkably well for what it is, and I did find myself wanting more. It's just hard to tell whether it's because I was satisfied, or I felt like I wasn't given enough. The biggest technical issues has to be when it comes to the visuals. Now, graphics aren't usually something I care about that much. If a game is fun or tells a great story, I can ignore it. But there were definitely moments where the visuals pulled me out of the experience. I played with all of my settings turned to the highest, and some scenes still looked surprisingly dated. I honestly couldn't tell if it was my monitor or the game itself most of the time. There were also moments where I could catch an NPC popping in and some visual glitches. The worst was probably watching these pipes fall down in this scene. It just, I don't know, it doesn't look right. It doesn't even rotate, they just kind of slide off. Another issue is that some missions can feel very slow. Most of the game maintains a solid pace, but there are sections where objectives become unclear and progress slows down a lot. There was one level in particular where I spent most of my time trying to figure out what the game wanted me to do, instead of actually just playing. It's never bad enough to ruin the experience, but there were moments where the pacing really lost its momentum, and it started to kind of drag on just a bit too long. The boss fights, although interesting, really didn't feel all that challenging. A lot of them encouraged using the environment to help you, and there was some variety, but they really weren't that difficult. This is mostly noticeable with Baby Webb's fight. Great character, but man, his fights really were simple. Doesn't help that the game doesn't give you time to figure it out for yourself, because Bond constantly mentions that he can't fight him head on, and I have to use the environment. It's just going back to that thing where the game doesn't let you figure it out on your own. Now, a lot of the missions do give you the freedom to do what you need to do, however, others do feel too linear, and this isn't a bad thing when a lot's happening like a gunfight, but it definitely did drag on, especially when trying to find my way through this goddamn office. I really did not like this level. This level is probably my biggest complaint in the entire game, if I'm being honest now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, definitely. One final complaint. Even though I enjoyed the story, it very much felt more like a setup for a bigger story in the future than its own self-contained story. Which isn't horrible, it just makes the game feel a bit incomplete. A good example of this would have been God of War 2018, where the story wraps up while setting up the sequel without making you feel like you're missing out on anything. 007 First Light does leave you wanting more because it's good, but also because you feel like you are missing some answers. Overall, 007 First Light is a great story and an okay game. The new mechanics, which were to make this game different from others in this genre, are different, but not enough to make it feel like a unique experience. It's not bad, but it's nothing special. The story was great, but some things could have done better, and I'm hoping that if there's a second game, we'll get some more character growth and the story will feel a bit more rounded. In reality, 007 First Light is the beginning of a great story behind an okay game.